Malik Carter was a straight-A student, captain of the debate team, the kind of teenager who quoted Baldwin and read Supreme Court opinions for fun. In Oak Ridge, Alabama, a town still haunted by its past, Malik stood out. And not everyone liked that. Malik had just returned from Harvard's prestigious Future Jurists summer program. He'd spent 2 weeks debating legal theory with Ivy League professors. One in particular took notice, Professor Evelyn Monroe. It started with a favor. Malik borrowed his friend Andre's car to pick up textbooks. A traffic stop turned everything sideways when police claimed the car was stolen. Despite Malik showing the text messages proving permission, body cam footage was mysteriously missing. Malik was handcuffed, searched, and tossed in the back of a cruiser for a stolen car charge. But what made no sense was how fast the system moved after. Judge Ronald Whitmore had a reputation. He ran his courtroom like a private kingdom, and when Malik stood before him for the first time, something felt off. Too quick, too cold, too quiet. Malik's assigned attorney barely spoke. No cross-examination, no mention of the texts, no character witnesses, just a sigh, a shrug, and a guilty plea pushed onto a scared teen. Judge Whitmore didn't deliberate. He didn't ask questions. He looked at Malik and said, "You'll serve 18 months in juvenile detention. Actions have consequences. No bail, no mercy, just silence. No headline, no outrage." Oak Ridge didn't blink. Another black teen sentenced. Business as usual. But someone had been watching Malik's future from far away. Malik's mother, Cassandra Carter, desperate and devastated, sent an email, not to a lawyer, not to the media, but to the only person who had believed in her son, Professor Evelyn Monroe. When Monroe read the email, she froze. Her student, Malik Carter, was in jail? She made one phone call to the Oak Ridge courthouse. What she heard made her sick. Professor Monroe wasn't just a scholar. She was a former civil rights litigator. She packed her bags and boarded a flight to Alabama. This wasn't just about Malik anymore, it was about the system. Monroe stepped into Oak Ridge like a storm. She was met with sideways glances, closed doors, and veiled warnings. The town didn't like outsiders, especially those who asked too many questions. Monroe tried to access Malik's case file. It was sealed. Mysteriously, documents were misfiled, footage unavailable. Someone didn't want her seeing the truth. When she finally saw Malik, he looked like a ghost. Thin, tired, scared. But his voice was steady. "They didn't even listen to me." Monroe began digging, and she found a pattern: black teenagers, all from the same neighborhood, all sentenced by Whitmore, all without proper defense. This wasn't an accident. It was a machine. A former court clerk contacted Monroe anonymously. They warned her, "Judge Whitmore's docket is a graveyard for kids like Malik." The same court-appointed attorney had handled over 90% of the juvenile cases in Whitmore's court, and almost never appealed. Rumors swirled of backdoor deals and budget kickbacks. Monroe filed an emergency appeal to overturn the conviction. The local appeals court denied it without comment. But Monroe had one more option: take it federal. Monroe wrote a letter to the New York Times. It began, "A child sits in a cell for a crime he didn't commit, because a judge decided his future didn't matter." Within 48 hours, #JusticeForMalik was trending. News vans rolled into Oak Ridge. Suddenly, the courthouse lights were just a little too bright. Whitmore denied any wrongdoing. "I follow the law," he said on camera. But records now revealed he'd sentenced black youth at 6x the rate of white counterparts for identical offenses. Monroe filed a civil suit against Judge Whitmore and the Oak Ridge court system. The charge: systemic racial discrimination and judicial misconduct. Oak Ridge had never seen a march like this. Students, lawyers, journalists, all chanting Malik's name. Some local leaders tried to suppress it, but the crowd only grew louder. Monroe's hotel room was ransacked. Threatening letters arrived at her office. One message read, "Go back to Harvard before we bury you like we did the others." Monroe tightened her security, but kept going. "They're scared. That means we're getting close." An anonymous janitor at the courthouse slipped Monroe a flash drive. It contained security footage of the courtroom, unedited. It showed the public defender and the judge talking privately before Malik's hearing. That footage proved they had met for 7 minutes off the record, before Malik entered the room. A blatant violation of judicial ethics. With that video, Monroe went to the U.S. Department of Justice. Within a week, the FBI opened a formal investigation into Judge Whitmore. A federal judge granted a motion to reopen Malik's case. This time, Monroe was by his side. And this time, the world was watching. Monroe brought out witnesses, texts, timeline data, and even expert testimony. The judge listened, and the truth was clear. Malik was innocent. Under questioning, Judge Whitmore grew defensive, angry, erratic. Eventually, he invoked the Fifth Amendment. The walls were closing in. After 211 days in detention, Malik Carter was declared innocent. The courtroom erupted in applause. His mother wept. Monroe smiled. Justice at last. CNN, NPR, The Washington Post. Malik's story was everywhere. A documentary deal was signed. Monroe was hailed as a hero. But she stayed humble. This was never about me. Harvard not only reinstated Malik's scholarship, they awarded him a special citation for courage under injustice. The judge was suspended, then indicted. The FBI uncovered financial kickbacks from the private juvenile facility Malik had been sent to. It wasn't just Whitmore. It was a network of judges, lawyers, and facility operators exploiting black youth for profit. Malik's case had cracked it open. Monroe testified before Congress. Her statement led to the Juvenile Sentencing Accountability Act, now law. Some in Oak Ridge blamed Monroe for ruining a good judge. But others, especially parents of affected teens, thanked her for saving their children. At a press conference, Malik stood before a microphone. They tried to erase me, but now I'm going to be a lawyer, so I can stop this from happening again. Malik enrolled at Harvard that fall, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resistance and rebirth. A podcast revealed secret recordings from within the court, confirming everything Monroe had suspected. More arrests followed. Monroe and Malik co-wrote, "They Tried to Bury Us," a true story of law and justice. It became a bestseller. Malik mentored students from marginalized communities, teaching them how to fight the system that once tried to bury him. The town voted in a new judge, a black woman, Judge Denise Rainey. Reform began to take root. Malik visited his former cell and left a copy of his Harvard acceptance letter in it. Professor Monroe retired from teaching to run a nonprofit legal advocacy group, the Carter Initiative. Other towns began examining their own courts. Malik's story became a case study in legal ethics classes across America. Malik spoke at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund Gala. "I was nearly buried by a broken system, but one voice, one professor stood up. And now I will stand for others." Whitmore was convicted, stripped of his title, sentenced to federal prison. The system had finally judged the judge. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a story of defiance, of courage, and of one boy whose voice was nearly stolen, but came back louder than ever. Malik's exoneration wasn't the end, it was the spark. Across Alabama, families began coming forward, sharing stories of eerily similar sentencing patterns. They whispered names: Judge Whitmore, Public Defender Hal Brooks, Detention Director Lennox. Monroe wasn't surprised. She had seen systemic patterns before. But even she didn't expect what came next. 17 other teenagers had been funneled through Whitmore's courtroom with forged affidavits, missing files, and no legal advocacy. One had attempted suicide. Another had died inside the same detention facility Malik had survived. The snowball had turned into an avalanche. Though publicly hailed as a symbol of hope, Malik was quietly unraveling. He couldn't sleep. The sound of keys jangling reminded him of the guard who used to scream outside his cell. He sometimes spoke mid-sentence to people who weren't there, his mind replaying court moments like loops. One night, he broke down in Harvard Yard. A professor walking by found him curled on a bench. He whispered, What if they find a way to take it all back? PTSD had replaced prison bars, and no amount of applause could undo the psychological scars. In a closed-door session, two federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice sat across from Professor Monroe. "We believe your case exposed a wider conspiracy," one said, placing a thick manila folder on the desk. Inside were redacted memos, timelines, bank statements, and one name circled in red ink. Operation Oak Ridge. What had started as judicial misconduct was now being reframed as a targeted, federally overlooked abuse network with financial and racial motives. And it reached beyond just one town. In Atlanta, news broke that the CEO of Southern Correctional Youth Facilities, Clayton Hurst, had met multiple times with Whitmore over golf weekends. Emails surfaced. "Keep the flow steady, Ron. Quotas look low this month." Monroe gasped. Quotas? For children? They weren't just jailing teens. They were trafficking bodies for profit. A team of Harvard law students working under Monroe followed the money. They traced campaign contributions from private prison firms to judges, sheriffs, and juvenile defense contractors across the South. $3.2 million. All legally declared. All morally filthy. These weren't isolated cases, they were part of a pay-to-sentence pipeline. Standing under the Capitol dome, Malik's voice trembled. Cameras flashed. Lawmakers leaned in. "I was 17. I wasn't a criminal. I was a student. I had dreams. But I sat in a cage so a man in a robe could get a bonus." The room fell silent. For once, Washington listened not to a lobbyist, not to a PAC, but to a survivor. A leaked DOJ memo titled Juvenile Risk Control Strategy, 2016 surfaced. It suggested prioritizing court systems in high-crime, low-income black neighborhoods as target-rich environments for privatized correctional partnerships. Malik read it twice, then again. They had written this in stone, like policy, like business. His life had been part of someone's corporate spreadsheet. Two former juvenile center guards came forward with damning statements. They claimed kids were denied basic health care to cut costs, beaten for discipline. One revealed that Malik had been flagged as a non-compliant intellectual. A threat, not because of violence, but because of his vocabulary. "They feared smart black boys more than violent ones," she said. "Smart ones can speak, can fight back." Mayor Elston of Oak Ridge had given annual bonuses to Judge Whitmore, signed off personally. When grilled by the press, he stammered, "We just wanted to lower the town's crime stats. We didn't know." But an unearthed memo showed his signature on a performance award based on juvenile sentencing volume. He knew. They all knew. Parents, teachers, and students formed the Oak Ridge Truth Commission. They opened files, collected testimonies, staged sit-ins. Some stood on courthouse steps with pictures of their jailed children, chanting, "This courtroom sold our kids." Malik met several other teens from Whitmore's courtroom. Jalen had been jailed for loitering near a gas station. Tanisha was detained for skipping school while caring for her sick grandmother. They all had one thing in common. They were black. They were poor. And no one had defended them. Malik vowed they would all be heard. Inspired by Monroe and Malik, Harvard launched the Carter Justice Fellowship, placing young lawyers in underserved court systems nationwide. Its motto, "To defend those the system forgets." Malik helped train the first cohort. One of the students had once shared a cell with him. To reach those beyond the courtroom, Malik launched a podcast. His first episode, "How I Was Sold to a Prison While My Teacher Waited for Me to Come Home." It went viral. His voice cracked with pain, but burned with purpose. The podcast won awards. But more importantly, it lit fires in hearts across the nation. In a last attempt, Judge Whitmore filed an appeal for wrongful conviction, claiming the media had influenced his trial. His appeal was unanimously denied. In the written opinion, the federal judge declared, "This is not a case of media bias. This is the consequence of unchecked cruelty." Months later, Malik received a letter from an inmate on death row. He wrote, "I watched your story. I was sentenced by Whitmore II back in '99. I had no one like you, but now I have hope. Keep going. You're fighting for ghosts like me." Malik sat in silence, then folded the letter. He had once thought of himself as a victim. Now he knew. He was a torchbearer. Inside a locked archive room beneath the Alabama courthouse sat a forgotten filing cabinet misplaced, according to court records. Monroe and Malik received anonymous instructions from a former clerk. Cabinet number 43. Bottom drawer. No cameras. Inside were case files of 64 juveniles, all flagged in red ink with two chilling codes. RFB revenue from booking. LIS low influence status. The codes weren't legal. They were financial tags. Children labeled based on how profitable and defenseless they were. Each file had a photo attached. Malik looked at them. Smiling faces. Some barely older than 10. They had been turned into dollar signs. The national media storm couldn't be ignored anymore. CNN aired a primetime expose. Profit by sentencing. The scandal that sold our youth. Reporters uncovered that DOJ inspectors had flagged irregularities in Oak Ridge years earlier, but closed the file due to budget constraints. Senators called it a cover-up. Protesters flooded Washington demanding federal accountability. Even the president was asked on camera, "Why did the DOJ ignore a town selling its children to prison?" His response, "We're looking into it." But the public wanted more than words. They wanted heads to roll. An 84-year-old man named Joseph Finn, a retired Oak Ridge juvenile guard, approached Monroe's office with shaking hands and a tape recorder. He had worked during the early 2000s. He had kept a diary of abuse. One entry read, "Inmate number 2074, 14 years old, begged for a blanket." Supervisor said, "We don't coddle inventory." He pressed play on the recorder. Guard's voice, "You want to get your hours or not?" Break his spirit. That one thinks he's got rights. Malik froze. That voice. That sneer. It was the same guard who once tore up his letter to his mother. Under immense pressure, the Alabama governor was forced to speak at a televised address. He looked stiff, pale, flanked by silent advisors. The state of Alabama apologizes to Malik Carter and all affected youth. We have failed our children. But as he spoke, emails leaked showing that his campaign had accepted over $200,000 from Southern Correctional Youth Facilities. Apology or damage control. Either way, the public wasn't buying it. A whistleblower sent Monroe a spreadsheet, one that chilled her. It detailed quarterly bonuses given to employees based on number of days served by inmates. Inmate compliance. Low equals more punishment equals more isolation equals higher bonus. Recidivism reentry rate. The more kids who returned, the more profitable it became. The heading of the spreadsheet read, Youth Incarceration Efficiency Dashboard. Efficiency. The word stung. They'd built an industrial complex powered by broken futures. Invited onto a major late-night talk show, Malik was asked, "How does it feel to be a hero?" He smiled awkwardly, tried to answer, but halfway through he froze. Sweat, short breath, trembling fingers. The lights blurred. PTSD hit hard. On live television, he broke down, sobbing into his hands. The audience didn't laugh. They didn't clap. They just sat, silent, watching a survivor crumble under the weight of being inspirational. A federal warrant allowed Monroe's team to seize internal surveillance tapes from the Oak Ridge Juvenile Facility. One tape showed Malik being slapped by a guard while restrained. Another showed a 13-year-old being dragged down a hallway by his ankle. But one tape stood out. It showed Judge Whitmore touring the facility. He laughed as a supervisor joked, "We keep him scared and sleepy. That's the recipe." Whitmore nodded. His silence was confirmation. Years had passed. His name had been cleared, but something unfinished haunted him. He returned alone to the courthouse in Oak Ridge. Same worn marble floor, same cracked wooden benches, same courtroom 3C where his life was derailed. He sat on the defendant's bench, just to feel it again, and then whispered to no one in particular, "I forgive you, but I'll never forget you." Netflix premiered a new documentary, Caged for Profit, The Malik Carter Story. It detailed not only Malik's ordeal, but the other youth, the guards, the judges, the money trail. It won Sundance. garnered Emmy buzz. But more importantly, it became required viewing in high school civics classes across America. The truth wasn't just archived. It was taught. Now wearing an orange jumpsuit, Whitmore lived in the very system he once fed. Inmates recognized him. Some had passed through his court. Others had brothers, cousins, friends who had. He was no longer feared. He was watched. The prison assigned him solitary confinement for his own protection. He had sentenced over 300 kids to isolation. Now he'd spend the next decade in the dark. Using settlement money and donations, Malik launched the Carter Foundation for Judicial Reform. It funded public defenders, trained advocates, and most importantly, created an app called Check the Judge that let families review judicial histories before trial. It became a national tool. Knowledge, once denied, was now freely distributed. Not all of Whitmore's victims survived. Tanisha, one of the teens Malik met, had taken her own life 2 years after release. She left behind a journal. Her final entry read, "They broke me when they caged me. I just wanted to be heard. I'm so tired of screaming into nothing." Malik brought flowers, knelt, and said, "You were heard. I promise, Tanisha. You were heard." Senator Ramirez introduced the Carter Juvenile Sentencing Act. It banned private juvenile detention, mandated attorney representation for all minors, and enforced transparency audits for family court judges. Passed with bipartisan support. Whitmore's cruelty had ignited political revolution. Malik was invited to the White House to witness it signed into law. Malik received thousands of letters. One stood out. A 14-year-old from Detroit wrote, "They tried to expel me last year, but I watched your story. I read my rights. They backed off. Now I'm gonna be a lawyer. Like you. Like Monroe." Malik wept. Not for the pain, but for the possibility. The pipeline hadn't just been exposed. It had been cracked. Years later, Malik stood at Harvard Law, now a visiting professor, teaching his first class. He looked out at rows of eager, diverse, bold students. Behind him, a quote was etched into the wall. "Justice doesn't wait for the brave. It waits for the relentless." He turned to the class and asked, "Who here wants to tear down systems built on silence?" Every hand rose. Malik smiled. It had begun. Just as Malik prepared to launch a national speaking tour with the Carter Foundation, a plain manila envelope appeared in his Harvard faculty mailbox. Inside, a photo of Malik standing outside his childhood home. A printed message. "You take down one system, another always replaces it. No return address. No fingerprints." Malik showed Monroe. She looked at the message and whispered, "This isn't over." An investigative journalist named Clea Jensen uncovered that one of the private prison companies forced to shut down after the Oak Ridge scandal had rebranded itself and was now operating charter schools for at-risk youth. Same board, same CEO, same strategy. Funnel kids from classrooms into confinement. And guess who sat on the board? A disbarred Judge Whitmore's former law partner. Malik's blood boiled. Monroe got a call from a retired Harvard archivist. He'd found an unmarked box in the basement of Langdell Law Library. Inside, handwritten letters, financial records, a list labeled Targeted Minors, Oak Ridge Initiative, and one name at the top, Malik Carter. The plan to jail him had been pre-planned years before his arrest. It had always been a setup. A cybersecurity breach hit the Carter Foundation. All donation tracking was wiped. Emails deleted. Grant data stolen. The investigation traced the breach to a laptop at a coffee shop in D.C. But the IP address led to a surprising name. James Croft, Monroe's former clerk. Trusted. Loyal. Or so they thought. Croft had been bribed. And he wasn't done. Croft's betrayal wasn't just about money. It was strategic. He had planted forged evidence that suggested Malik's foundation was funneling money to political groups. Croft's goal? To discredit Malik. To make it look like Malik had become the very thing he fought against. Within hours, news broke. Carter Foundation under federal review. U.S. Marshals showed up at Malik's apartment with a warrant. He was arrested in front of neighbors and students for fraud and misuse of nonprofit funds. He knew it was fake. Monroe knew it was a setup. But now Malik was back in a cell, the place he had spent his teenage years. Irony, cruelty, and power. History repeating. Monroe had a backup server. On it was an audio recording of Croft, boasting to a lobbyist. "He's just another pawn. Once he's out, we go back to business." Same system, new name. It was the smoking gun, and Monroe had it in her hands. Monroe stormed into federal court and demanded an emergency hearing. She played the audio. The judge, once skeptical, leaned forward. The tape ended with Croft saying, "Tell the board, Project Pipeline is back on." Courtroom silence. The judge looked up and said, "All charges against Mr. Carter are dismissed. Effective immediately." Monroe made sure the cameras rolled as James Croft was handcuffed outside his D.C. apartment. He wore a smug look until he saw the FBI agents. Then, panic. Croft didn't realize the feds had more than fraud charges. They had conspiracy, bribery, obstruction, and child endangerment. The maximum sentence? 95 years. Malik's legal team subpoenaed Croft's call logs. They found a number linked to Alabama's new governor. Turns out, the governor had reinstated old juvenile justice contracts, using shell companies and silent investors. The scandal erupted again. Louder, uglier. Nationwide, Malik was called to testify before the U.S. Senate. He stood under oath and spoke about the system, the lies, the sabotage. His closing words stunned the nation. "I was jailed for nothing, freed by truth, framed again, but I'm still standing. And so are the kids I fight for." Applause. Standing ovation. Even senators cried. From his prison cell, a sickly Judge Whitmore offered a deal. He had kept a journal and a secret recording. On it, lobbyists openly discussed replacing youth courts with for-profit behavioral centers. He handed it over. His final words? "This is my confession. Do what I never had the courage to do." Using the recordings, the DOJ launched Operation Echo Chamber. 48 arrests. 3 state legislators indicted. 6 judges suspended. 9 CEOs under federal probe. The machine that imprisoned Malik was systematically dismantled. One cog at a time, Malik hosted a private event for survivors of Oak Ridge. They came from all over the country, broken but not destroyed. Many had stories of addiction, homelessness, trauma, but they also had hope. And one by one they stood to say, "You gave me back my voice." Malik broke down. Tears, laughter, hugs. It was healing. At a youth summit hosted by the Carter Foundation, teenagers gave presentations on legal advocacy, peer defense networks, school-to-prison pipeline alternatives. One 16-year-old said, "We're not waiting for change. We're creating it." The audience erupted in cheers. The next generation wasn't afraid. Malik returned to the solitary cell where he once spent 47 days as a teen. It hadn't changed much. Cold, rusted, small. But this time he stood on the other side of the door, holding the keys. He locked the cell, then handed the keys to a museum curator. "Turn it into a reminder," he said. "Never again." Croft stood in court, sweaty, unshaven, disgraced. The judge read out the charges. All of them. Sentencing, 72 years. No parole. He looked at Malik sitting in the front row. Malik said nothing. He didn't need to. Justice had a face now. And it wasn't Croft's. Congress passed the Malik Carter Juvenile Integrity Act. It abolished private juvenile prisons, banned incentive-based sentencing, created a national oversight board for youth justice. It was the most sweeping juvenile reform in 50 years. Years later, Malik was invited to give the commencement speech at Harvard Law. He stood where he once sat as a scared, unsure student. His voice cracked but didn't falter. "They tried to silence a kid. That only taught me how to speak louder. They caged me, and I turned it into a key." Malik visited his childhood neighborhood. Kids ran past him playing basketball. The community center now bore a new name, the Malik Carter Youth Center. He smiled. For once, the scars didn't hurt. Justice isn't just punishment. It's prevention. It's protection. And sometimes, it's one voice that refuses to shut up. Stay tuned for more chilling cases on Cold Case Chronicles, where the truth is always darker than fiction. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to Cold Case Chronicles. We dive deeper into the most chilling, unsolved mysteries, and together, we uncover what was left behind. Like, share, and leave a comment below. We want to hear your thoughts. Stay vigilant. Stay curious. The truth never rests.